Hare Om Namaha. Quote, he guides him so that he will, this life, his progress of life, may be systematic. Now, to take such guidance means the spiritual master should also be a very perfect man. Otherwise, how can he guide? Unquote. Quote, there was a saying, just take this garb, and the dress will tell you what to do. Take the military dress, and the dress will direct what you have to do, what will be your duty, unquote. And if the band you're in starts playing different tunes, I'll see you on the dark side of the moon. After the disappearance of Prabhupada from manifest physical presence, the ISKCON movement became very bewildered. Things first got worse, then worse than that, then even worse. A mistake got compounded with two solutions which were also mistakes. Mistaken knowledge abounded. One such egregious quote-unquote mistake is described above, to wit, whatever dress you put on, the garb will turn you into that thing. Put on the dress of a guru, and the dress will magically turn you into a guru. Flawed at every stage, a narrative was created and it metastasized. The misleaders of their own deviated movement, in the name of Prabhupada and ISKCON, of course, kept trying to conceal what was unraveling badly by making even more mistakes. Distress was felt everywhere, although some were anticipating a great new development in the movement, with 11 heartbeats overcoming the one strong heartbeat of the founder Acharya, who had departed. This was also proven to be a naive expectation. Those who were actually following the founder Acharya knew, both within and without, that his movement, led by what proved to be ambitious, contaminated leaders, had now moved to the dark side of the moon. Why did it all go down? If we dig deep, if we try to get to the root of that descending octave, there is only one answer to this question which completely suffices. There were no gurus in ISKCON Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness after Prabhupada left. He left it to function on its own compromised power, which is what they wanted. Your host speaker is analyzing the second publication of Henry Doktorsky, his most important work to date, entitled 11 Naked Emperors. As always, henceforward, references to this book will be under the acronym ENE. We're at Chapter 6 right now, and the title of Chapter 6 is Rise of the Zonal Acharyas. It's a long chapter, and it is loaded. It begins, however, and most unfortunately, with a major speed bump. You can overcome that flaw by understanding its blemish clearly. All the hell which followed what this chapter introduces can be summarized as stemming from the simple fact that after Prabhupada departed, there were no genuine gurus in his movement, and, combined with that, no one was trying to become Siddha. nor was a genuine guru consulted. The fact that there were no gurus in the movement after Prabhupada, combined with an irrational exuberance about and faith in the vitiated GBC, to make for a bad situation. The temple presidents did not emphasize becoming perfect. They didn't even mention it anymore. Everyone put too much stock into the institution and not where it belonged. Where it belonged was on the individual devotee utilizing the facilities of that institution in order to become a perfect man, which means a bona fide spiritual master in Vaishnavism. E.N.E. touched upon this somewhat obliquely in the following excerpt, quote, "There was an amazing degree of faith in the concept that the GBC were empowered and pure, that Srila Prabhupada was going to act through them, and thus the correct and proper conclusions were going to be properly arrived at by our trusted senior godbrothers," unquote. It was not amazing. It was mind-boggling, because the GBC had not produced anything of significance since the first year of its creation in 1970. Over and above this, you do not rely upon some kind of commission in order to spread Krishna consciousness to other conditioned souls in human form. It is spread by pure devotees, not by a commission. It is spread by pure devotees who have received the order to become spiritual masters from the real founder Acharya, not by the edicts or resolutions of some kind of commission. And now we get into the thicket of this 6th chapter of the book, E.N.E. It cites what Doktorsky considers to be a fact, although there should be a red flag immediately spotted in connection with this so-called fact. The book cites a Neomat leader and sannyasi of the name Bhakti Bhavan Vishnu. This fellow was, and if he is still alive, is, 100% a pillar of Neomat. He was a devoted follower of Swami B.R. Sridhar. It is virtually certain that he received his new label, his current name, from the Navadvip Mahant, as well as his bamboo cloth staff. As stated in E.N.E. in an endnote, and appreciated by me that this was added, of course, this belief, mentioned herein as a fact, although I consider it a belief, was allegedly from a room conversation with Prabhupada in his quarters in Vrindavan in October 1978. That's what the book says, by the Vishnu Swami, by the Vishnu sannyasi. Oh, immediate problem. Prabhupada had not been manifest for 11 months previous to that date. An error? Sure. But consider that publishing such an error can be Paramatma's way of signaling that the whole thing, in the guise of being a fact, is actually in error. The excerpt from E.N.E. I'm about to read was from a book by this Vishnu sannyasi entitled The Hare Krishna Movement, the Post-Charismatic Fate of a Religious Transplant. By the way, in case you didn't notice it, there's a not-so-subtle aparad contained in that subtitle. As could only have been expected, the sannyasi's book was published by the Guardian of Devotion, which is 100% Neomat. This was the Neomat organization, until the emergence of its World Vaishnav Association later on, which is its current branding. Bottom line, E&E utilizes this flawed concept from the excerpt, flawed in more ways than one, by the way, in order to make a point, allegedly a fact, which no listener or reader of this podcast is whatsoever obliged to accept as factual. So now let us proceed to that comment by the Vishnu Sannyasi. Quote, despite Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's order to his disciples not to associate with his godbrothers, just see how he introduces this. I got to interject something here. He's saying, despite Prabhupada's order. Right there. Throw the rest out. Despite Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's order to his disciples not to associate with his godbrothers, and we're going to mention those orders that he gave in that direction coming up here. Just see how he introduces this. He slaps you right in the face. He slaps you right across the face. From that point on, you should say, even if I'm going to bother to read this, which I shouldn't, but even if I'm going to bother to read it, I should toss it all out. Anyway, let's start at the beginning again from this Vishnu Sannyasi from his quote. Despite Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's order to his disciples not to associate with his godbrothers, on more than one occasion he gave permission for them to consult with B.R. Sridhar Maharaj. One time, shortly before he passed away, Prabhupada instructed Tamal Krishna Goswami, Hansaduta Swami, Tripurari Swami, and others, in my absence, if you have any question regarding philosophy, you may consult my godbrother, Swami B.R. Sridhar at Navadvip. On another occasion, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada recommended to several disciples, Jayapataka, Giriraj, Tamal Krishna, and Rameshwar, that after his passing they should, quote, consult with him about philosophy and practical points, unquote. You need to be skeptical about this whole thing. We're going to give you reasons why to be skeptical coming up. But just see how he states this as fact, but first he introduces that what is known as fact, which I'm going to show very shortly, what is known as fact is despite Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's order to his disciples not to associate with his godbrothers. There you have a factual. You can verify it. You can validate it. It's proof positive. Everything after that is conjecture. So let us proceed. That this excerpt was included in chapter 6 is a blunder. That Vishnu Sannyasi's recollection is inserted in E&E as if it is factual. Maybe it was, maybe not. You have every reason to be skeptical about it. Although it was bandied about by a select section, described subsequently, as being a real event. Let me list 5 solid reasons you should be skeptical about it. 1. The excerpt is a written account in a book from a dyed-in-the-wool acolyte of Niyamut. It tailors to the flawed Niyamut perspective, obviously. Another way of saying the same thing is that there is a strong probability, if not a certainty, that it's nothing more than a biased account. 2. There is no tape recording of this so-called meeting or so-called order from Prabhupada, nor is there any transcript of it to be found. 3. What is the context? Let's say it exists. If we had a tape of it, we could glean a context. If we had a transcription of it, we could glean a context. Did Prabhupada even say or order any of these things? Surmising that it is possible, although your host speaker considers the whole thing to be bunk, surmising that it is possible that he did talk about this subject, what else did he say? We cannot know. because the Vishnu sannyasi does not provide anything except what suits his narrative, the Neomut narrative, which is severely flawed. 4. What about the orders? What about the orders Prabhupada gave in that important letter of April 28, 1974, where he stated, quote, "So it is better not to mix with my godbrothers very intimately, because instead of inspiring our students and disciples, they may sometimes pollute them. We shall be very careful about them and not mix with them. This is my instruction to you all. They cannot help us in our movement, but they are very competent to harm our natural progress," unquote. He gave similar orders on November 9th, 1975 to a president in Canada, quote, "So I have now issued orders that all my disciples should avoid all of my godbrothers. They should not have any dealings with them, nor even correspondence, nor should they give them any of my books, or should they purchase any of their books. Neither you should visit any of their temples. Please avoid them," unquote. We are to disregard these clear orders in favor of accepting a diatribe from a dedicated Neomut sannyasi? You have every reason to be skeptical. 5. Palena parchiate, judge by the results. What was the result of such close and intimate contact with Swami B.R. Sridhar? What was the result of lapping up all of his bad advice? Devastation to Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement. That's what. There's also something else you may note in connection to the references made about the supposed order of Prabhupada to consult with Swami B.R. Sridhar. Everyone channeling this quote-unquote order is in one of two categories. They are either devotees of Swami B.R. Sridhar, those who crossed the river and took sannyas from him, betraying allegiance to Prabhupada's movement in the process, or they are useful idiots from so-called ISKCON. Remember, until the Great Schism of 1982, the air quotes ISKCON leaders and their loyal followers were favorable to the man. It appeared superficially that he was helping them in their takeover. E&E shares an example of how, quote-unquote, this story, as another man recollects it, was passed around as ironclad fact in so-called ISKCON at that time. Quote, Dhruta Karmadas, an associate member of the Bhaktivedanta Institute who specializes in history and philosophy of science, also heard a similar story. Before leaving this world, Prabhupada told his leading disciples that if they had questions about Vaishnava practice, they could consult with Narayan Maharaj or Sridhar Maharaj. Some have tried to create a myth that Prabhupada wanted them to be, those two men, to be overall guides for ISKCON in his absence. But Prabhupada says that his own teachings were sufficient, unquote. At least this excerpt acknowledges that Prabhupada's teachings were sufficient, implying, at least indirectly, that the consultation was not really needed. It surely was not. What was needed were men who had taken the training from Prabhupada and had actually qualified themselves as gurus. Over and above the fact that there were no gurus in so-called ISKCON, such outside consultation produced disastrous results for Prabhupada's branch of the line, effectively polluting and destroying it. E&E goes on to make an astute comment about the whole debacle. Quote, why did the GBC need B.R. Sridhar Maharaj's advice? Hadn't their spiritual master already told them everything they needed to know? A few months before his passing, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada announced to his disciples, quote, "So there's nothing to be said new. Whatever I have to speak, I have spoken in my books," unquote. Nicely done. However, the counterpoint to this, examples of it specifically, is still presented near the beginning of chapter 6. That counterpoint to the actual truth is a blemish on chapter 6. It is questionable whether it should have even been included. What to speak of beating its drums via testimonials. Here's a quote from another senior man loyal to the institutional delusion at that time, and how consultation with Gaudiya Mutt was necessary when very much was not at all needed. Quote, "Srila Prabhupada had not given them one single instruction, zero, nothing, on how to set up such a system. They found that they had a million questions, and Srila Prabhupada had given them not a word or a vague hint how in the hell was the whole damn thing supposed to be set up and how was it to work. The GBC found themselves totally in the dark," unquote. Talk about a Gurvaparad. This is a Maha Gurvaparad. GBC totally in the dark? How could that be? These were the senior men who were Prabhupada's direct agents for seeing to it that his movement was managed properly by the temple presidents. They were supposed to be, the GBC men, were supposed to be the best of the Brahmins. They consulted with him constantly, both personally and by letter. And now it is alleged that he gave them no light, that he gave them no knowledge as to how to become guru. And the quote from this bellicose fellow, Amiyatma, refers to what was to be created after Prabhupada left as, and it refers to it as, quote, "the whole damn thing," unquote. He alleges, quote, "not even a vague hint," unquote, was given by Prabhupada, and that there was not one single instruction, zero, he shouts, about how to be guru given by Prabhupada. Wrong on all accounts. The right conception is that his leading men did not take the training, and therefore the training was not complete, because they didn't take it. If any man had become even a regular guru, then how to set up the aftermath of the disappearance would be easily conceptualized and carried out. Not at all difficult. Yet, as noted here repeatedly, none of them were gurus. They were in the dark for that reason. Then they took very bad advice from Gaudiya Mutt, leading to a major schism with that Asara organization in 1982. The resentment in this excerpt we just read is blatant. Bad attitude creates bad commentary, creating bad narrative. This narrative of Prabhupada being, at least indirectly, responsible for what went down after he left on the plea that his guidance was insufficient is Maha Gurv Aparad. You cannot pin any of it on him. Instead, pin it on the donkeys, his evil leaders. Now, it needs to be noted again, as we did in our first review of the first and second chapter, the author of E&E is not a devotee of Prabhupada, although he is an excellent researcher and historian of Prabhupada's Hare Krishna movement. Nevertheless, this chapter is mixed. There is quite a bit of really good stuff coming in later, and we're going to be discussing some of that. The debacle transpired after Prabhupada left because the leaders of so-called ISKCON failed to become gurus. And they failed to become gurus because they failed to follow the founder Acharya's instructions, although they enjoyed so many perks in the name of being the best of his devotees, which they weren't. Quote, however, despite the protestations by Tamal Krishna, Satsvarup, Harikesh, and Bhavananda, some others claim that Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada had given some instructions which they ignored. Quote, when I order you become guru, he becomes regular guru, that's all, unquote. Prabhupada did not instruct his disciples to become acharyas and sit on elevated thrones. When the 11, in tandem with the vitiated GBC, neglected their spiritual master's instructions and embarked on the zonal Acharya Diksha Guru course, they became lost in uncharted and unfamiliar waters. A catastrophic shipwreck was inevitable, unquote. That's, of course, from E&E. Once again, nicely done. A regular guru, which none of his leaders were, is not a Mahabhagavat. He is not a Jagat Guru. He cannot accept lavish worship from his disciples, what to speak of from God brothers or God sisters. It was not lack of instruction from Prabhupada as to how to be a regular guru that resulted in, quote unquote, the whole damn thing going down. It was lack of obedience which produced deviation, not a paucity of instruction. Quote, although Jayadvaita did not specifically say that some of the new gurus feel inadequate, it was implied in his question. B.R. Sridhar Maharaj responded in effect, quote, just wear the uniform of the guru, and if you are sincere, God will direct you what to do, unquote. B.R. Sridhar Maharaj explained, quote, when the Second Great War broke out in Calcutta, Dalhousie Square, military dress was written on the wall, was painted on the wall, and there was a saying, just take this garb, and the dress will tell you what you have to do. Do you follow? Take the military dress, and the dress will direct you what you have to do, what will be your duty, unquote. Again, remember that the, air quotes, ISKCON leaders were all favorable to the Navadvip Mahant because he was shining their apples. He was buttering their bread by providing fertile soil in which the 11 seeds of personal ambition could sprout, blossom, and flower. Were they using him? Sure. But he was also using them, although it would take time to realize this with certainty. They should have been hesitant and skeptical about him, but they weren't. And everyone, all of us, paid the price for that. Now here in this quote, the ISKCON sannyasi, Jayadvaita, explicitly repeats one of the poisonous tropes doled out by the Navadvip Mahant concerning just putting on the uniform and you become the soldier. You might remember this was quoted at the very beginning of our presentation here today. This is New Age philosophy. Vaishnava philosophy is entirely different. Vaishnava philosophy is first deserve, then desire. The exact opposite of the uniform trope. The consultation propaganda is there to convince the reader that all that went down between ISKCON and Gaudiya Math Navadvip was according to Prabhupada's desire, which it definitely was not. And then we have this little ditty from one of the 11 glorifying Swami B.R. Sridhar, quote, I take it that Prabhupada is speaking to us through you, unquote. How horrific. but par for the course at that time. E&E also shares how Swami B.R. Sridhar formulated the Acharya board. Quote, "There should be an Acharya board to guide the whole thing from behind, without non-Acharya within the meeting. Then if anybody is considered to be the most expert for the management, he will work under the Acharya board," unquote. This was a major deviation. Because so-called ISKCON had no gurus, all of its fools bought into this board within the real board. Prabhupada would never have approved of it. The non-guru contingent, all of them were members of the non-guru contingent in actuality, but the non-guru contingent within the GBC were supposed to be subordinate, according to this formulation, to the 11 great pretenders of the vitiated GBC. Tattvamasi. The Acharya Board, also known as the Acharya Standing Committee, recommended by the Navadvip Mahant as the best way for the governing body commission to make all decisions about gurus and disciples, was approved by the vitiated GBC 22-1. Only Hari Kesh voted against it. Then, concerning whether or not to consult him, meaning Swami B.R. Sridhar, Hari Kesh made a speech and voted against going to talk with him. Chapter 6 covers Hari Kesh's account about how his speech played out in the GBC. Again, in regard to whether they should go and consult him, Hari Kesh was outvoted 22-1 and also ridiculed in the process by Jayatirtha. All the descriptions about Hari Kesh's initial resistance in the Asat Sabha of the vitiated GBC in late March 1978, including his later jumping off of his so-called Vyasasan in Germany while being worshipped on it and running to his room. All of these descriptions are examples of Doktorsky's bulldog research efforts to uncover such hidden facts and incidents. Now we're going to read subtitles. They're my subtitles, but they're facsimiles of the subtitles that are in Chapter 6. So we break it down into parts. The first one is 11 allegedly appointed by Prabhupada. Prabhupada only appointed Ritviks. He did not recognize any gurus or even a regular guru. The appointment of gurus, alleged to have been made by Prabhupada, was an appointment that never was. What the 11 and their co-conspirators did was to merge the Ritvik appointment into a covert appointment of future Diksha gurus. It proved to be a very effective strategy. On bulletin boards throughout the international centers of the movement, it was advertised that Prabhupada, in the summer before his passing, had specifically named and appointed 11 spiritual masters to succeed him. It was a big lie, but virtually none of the rank and file could realize that. E.N.E. quotes one of the influential sannyasis in Raman Reti, and part of that excerpt describes the subterfuge. Quote, "If Prabhupada had actually appointed them, Prabhupada would have announced their appointment during his manifested presence, or they would have announced it shortly after his passing. But no, they waited 4 months to announce their appointments. Why? Because Prabhupada never appointed them. During those 4 months, and probably even before Prabhupada departed, they were colluding between themselves. Not the entire GBC. Only select members were involved in this conspiracy. It was a conspiracy of silence. They knew what they wanted to do, but they kept quiet about it until the March 1978 GBC meetings, unquote. This assessment is mostly factual, but not entirely so. Satsvarup, as editor of the BTG, spilled the beans earlier in an editorial. He was the scribe who wrote the most on the alleged appointment of gurus. This included a position paper with this subheader, quote, "in consultation with higher authorities," referring to those talks with Swami B.R. Sridhar. E.N.E. describes that as follows, quote, "At the same March 1978 meetings in which the zonal acharya system was established, the GBC approved a paper by Satsvarup Das Goswami entitled The Process for Carrying Out Srila Prabhupada's Desires for Future Initiations. The paper contained many ideas that came from conversations with B.R. Sridhar Maharaj, such as how a godbrother should act in the presence of one of the new ISKCON gurus. Satsvarup wrote, quote, "The Shishya will not tolerate any other Vaishnav coming to disturb the absolute position of his guru. This is the heart's feeling or proper Vaishnava sentiment, and disciples of Srila Prabhupada should be sensitive to this and careful not to disturb the relationship between the new gurus and their disciples. You may look upon your godbrother, who's now a guru, in your own way, but you must behave so that the new bhaktas and disciples' faith is not disturbed. Your conception of him," meaning that godbrother, so-called guru, "your conception of him may be kept in the mental world, but not shown on the outside," unquote. This GBC position paper rubber-stamped the appointment of 11 spiritual masters, and in the process injected more nescience into the mix. Through the institution's monthly magazine and GBC Imprimatur, along with, quote-unquote, consultation with higher authorities, it was turned into, air quotes, ISKCON dogma that Prabhupada named his gurus, which he didn't. Next subheader, divine successors. Next, E&E segues to the zonals allegedly becoming successors. Quote, "Some, if not all, of the zonal acharyas boasted, or at the very least did not contradict the erroneous belief, that they had become miraculously promoted from a lower stage of devotional service to the Uttama Adhikari stage by the inconceivable power of Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Tamal Krishna Goswami claimed, quote, Prabhupada conferred his blessings upon these disciples, seeing that they had dedicated themselves heart and soul to assisting him in the preaching mission. Thus, he considered them to be Uttama Adhikari, all highly advanced devotees worthy to be accepted as spiritual masters, unquote. It was TKG's scheme from the beginning. Remember, he's the one who wrote the letter appointing the Ritviks. Prabhupada simply signed on a line at the bottom left of it called approved. TKG knew well how he could parlay that appointment of Ritviks into the eventual appointment of Diksha Gurus, and this he did. He did so with the help, make that tremendous help, of Swami B.R. Sridhar of Navadvip. This was a boon for TKG. Now, not only did the Navadvip Mahant back the Ritviks automatically becoming spiritual masters by one of his tropes, namely Ritvik Acharya, then it becomes as good as Acharya. TKG also was encouraged to have all of them, himself obviously included, to be worshipped as Mahabhagavats, another trope from Swami V.R. Sridhar, Mat Guru Si Jagaguru. The pretenders certainly did praise Swami V.R. Sridhar, and they gave him all kinds of undue prominence for his poisonous advice. That was discussed in the next section of E&E, which that subtitle here I'm giving as Prominence Given to the Navadvip Mahant. And here's a quotation in that section. Quote, B.R. Sridhar Maharaj had become a highly respected advisor in ISKCON. Zonal gurus, sannyasis, and temple presidents visited him at his Navadvip ashram and asked for his opinions about matters which vexed them. Paranjan noted, quote, Sridhar Maharaj then became the darling Shiksha Guru of the ISKCON gurus and ISKCON overall. For example, Satsvarup was sending out audio tapes to all of ISKCON where the GBC were speaking with Sridhar. Hangsaduta installed huge photos of himself with Sridhar Maharaj in the foyer of the Berkeley Temple, and anyone who doubted Sridhar's authority was demonized and kicked out, unquote. He was materially empowering them, so the 11 and their henchmen gave him prominence. It would come back to bite them not far up the road, but they were obviously quite short-sighted about that. Prabhupada had taken Mahabhagavat worship as the real Jagaguru, and they looked upon the Navadvip Mahant as allegedly Prabhupada's Shiksha Guru. As such, they granted him prominence. They imitated Mahabhagavat worship for themselves because he told them, Mat Guru Si Jagaguru. That Bengali trope carried the day, and the stricture of regular guru, which none of them were, was ignored. It was easy to ignore it because nobody knew about it. The 11 and their co-conspirators made sure that everybody at that time knew about Swami B.R. Sridhar, however, although he was a complete unknown previously. Next subtitle, Extravagant Worship. E&E describes the extravagant worship that the new gurus, supposedly successors to Prabhupada, were taking once they got back to their new fiefdoms as acharyas of the zone. After all, if you're a Jagaguru, you can certainly be worshipped in that way. Prabhupada was alleged to have recognized them as such in July of 1977 as being special, and according to that false fact, he must have empowered them at that time as well. E&E comments upon this in summary as follows, quote, few or none of the 11, it appears, including Kirtanananda, as was revealed later, were firmly fixed on this basic rudimentary platform, much less on the more advanced platform of the Acharya, who is not an ordinary man, for he is the representative of all the demigods, who is, quote-unquote, non-different from Krishna, unquote. Acting above your adhikar or eligibility produces evil results in so-called spiritual life. This is a well-known principle. And as stated earlier, that is why the accompanying principle of first deserve, then desire must be both honored and preserved in any genuine bhakti cult. So-called ISKCON and its vitiated GBC threw all of this to the winds. Sow the wind and you reap the whirlwind in due course. That's exactly how it played out. They enjoyed, more than any other humans on the planet, the extravagant worship and everything attached to it, but only for about 8 years. Then they suffered like anything. And they continue to suffer now. We should not at all sympathize with any of them for the karmic reactions that they now must endure. Next subtitle: My Way or the Highway. E&E then segues to its next subtitle, which we repeat above just as it was published in the book. After taking advantage of the rich and fertile soil provided to them by the Navadvip Mahant, the new gurus, now princes of their own principalities known as zones, decided that the implementation stage must be forceful. In effect, how they took over the movement was nothing more than a kind of covert brute force, i.e. a pseudo-spiritual smash and grab. Here are 2 entries from Chapter 6 that describe their mentality and the brute anti-Brahminical action that accompanied it. Quote, Bhagavan Das, the initiating guru and GBC representative for France, Benelux, Italy, Israel, and co-GBC for Spain and Portugal, had a straightforward and unforgiving policy in dealing with godbrothers who questioned the legitimacy of the new gurus. During an August 1978 conversation with Tamal Krishna Goswami in the stairwell of the guest house at the Krishna Balaram Mandir in Vrindavan, Bhagavan boasted, quote, In my zone, it's simple. It's my way or the highway, unquote. Tamal Krishna responded with a loud laugh, unquote. Quote, within his book, Divine or Demoniac, Spiritual Movements and the Enemies Within, Thanishvar Das recalled, quote, many gurus demanded that godbrothers and sisters worship them as they had Srila Prabhupada, and if they would not, they were rejected from the society. The new gurus, having the support of many adoring disciples, became the predominant political force, and Srila Prabhupada's disciples, although senior and experienced, were the odd man out. Insubordination was dealt a heavy hand. The policy everywhere was not one of love and cooperation or even live and let live, but my way or the highway, unquote. No need to go further in describing this because the purport is self-evident. Next subtitle. GBC empowers itself to vote in new gurus. The Asat Sabha of the vitiated GBC of 1978 also introduced another major deviation in relation to guru. All 11 of whom were recognized by the Commish as spiritual masters, and they constituted, as we noted before, the Acharya Standing Committee, which was completely unauthorized. And it introduced future guru by supermajority vote. E&A describes it in this way, quote, the 1978 GBC resolutions specified that new ISKCON gurus, in addition to the original 11, could only be authorized by a 3/4 majority vote by the GBC. One GBC resolution indicated, quote, the GBC will consider each year the appointment of new spiritual masters to be approved by 3/4 vote, unquote. Although a deviated way to determine a genuine Vaishnava spiritual master, the Asat Sabha did make it very difficult to attain at that time. Later on, this voting procedure, again totally unauthorized, was modified substantially. E&E does not get into that in Chapter 6, however. Back in the day, late 70s, the minutes of its meetings were kept in semi-secrecy. So few knew of this concoction of voting for Guru by supermajority. That's the way the Kamish wanted it. As could only have been expected, no one in 1978 was even nominated to receive that supermajority vote, and no new gurus were created in this impersonal papal voting dynamic. Of course, those 11 imposters were created, but none of them were voted into the post. Everybody just wrongly assumed that they were gurus appointed and recognized by Prabhupada and then rubber stamped by the Navadvip Mahant and good to go as acharyas of their zones. The band was playing a different tune, and no one would be able to make any progress in Siddha realization by believing in that different tune or cooperating with it. Next subtitle, 11 Naked Emperors. Doktorsky chooses to close Chapter 6 with a subtitle, The Naked Emperors, which is a slight modification of the title of his book. That's always acceptable, although this writing technique, is generally used for a chapter title rather than a subtitle. Your host speaker is quoted extensively in this final section of Chapter 6, and I so choose to reproduce some of those excerpts in closing my review here in this presentation. Quote, the zonal acharya system was a disaster waiting to happen, but few could foresee its negative effects at the time, except for Pradyumna, Guru Kripa Swami, Yashodananda Swami, Gauridas Pandit, Kailasa Chandra, and others. One last point regarding B.R. Sridhar Maharaj must be noted. Some say that he knew that Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada had appointed the 11 as Ritviks, and he encouraged the 11 to become zonal acharyas. Quote, Ritvik acharya, then it becomes as good as acharya, unquote. Kailasa Chandra recalled, quote, remember, none of us knew at the time how what was being received from Swami B.R. Sridhar was loaded with nescience. I was, at most, only mildly suspicious of what he was spouting, and this is evidenced by the GBC position paper of 1979, which still accepts Sridhar Maharaj as authority. Nevertheless, I specifically remember that 1978 statement, word for word, namely Ritvik Acharya, then it becomes as good as Acharya. In conclusion, Chapter 6 begins with a major speed bump, which is certainly a blemish. That cannot be neglected in grading it. However, it recovers nicely. As such, it liberally grades out as a straight B. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. It got over via lies, false presuppositions, Gaudiya nescience, secrecy, intimidation, and a despotic kind of smash and grab with a bad astral smell. Remember this. Nothing good can come from a so-called spiritual organization that is built upon a superstructure without gurus. Sadeva Samya.